Welcome, welcome, welcome to the next episode of the CEO Next Door. Our focus on this podcast is founder stories. Here with me today is my co-host, Donovan Morrison, and our esteemed guest, founder and CEO of Launchpeer, Jake Hare. How's it going, Jake?
Good. Thanks, guys, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. Why don't we start with getting to know you a little bit? Tell us about yourself and what makes you tick and what you've been up to.
Yeah. So, like you said, I'm Jake Hare. I'm founder of Launchpeer. Launchpeer is a accelerator really focused on startups that are at the very earliest stages. And I'm talking like napkin sketch stage. I mean, they're probably still working their 9-to-5 job. All they can think about is starting a startup and just haven't made that move yet. So our goal at Launchpeer is to take them from having a napkin sketch to a built product and first checks from outside investors. So it's kind of a hybrid between an agency, because we do a lot of stuff for our founders like branding, design, development, but we also have a lot of the typical accelerator stuff like mentor networks, a lot of perks, coaching, a curriculum, things like that. So we've kind of taken the best of the agency model, taking the best of the accelerator model and kind of melded them together to something that I don't really have a name for because it's not something people normally do. But my entrepreneur journey starts, I'd say really, really early when I was a kid. I grew up in California. I was homeless when I was a teenager for a while. My dad and my mom both battled, addiction. My dad was an alcoholic. My mom she did harder drugs. And so, we were those kids that got passed around. Every court hearing was, going back and forth to somebody else having custody. And that was basically my entire childhood. But I was able to kind of claw my way into college. But I say my entrepreneurial journey started back then because when you're a kid who's homeless, for a while, it's not like I was homeless my whole childhood, but you still have to eat. You still gotta, you don't want to be the kid that's not able to actually buy lunch at school. So, my parents didn't have a lot of money, so I had to figure out ways to make money. And when I was a kid, I wasn't an entrepreneur. I was just I need to eat, and I don't want to eat the terrible school cafeteria food. I want to buy some lunch. So I would sell art drawings to my friends or, figure out how to gamble on Monday Night Football games. And I was terrible at that. I think there was a streak where I lost 17 in a row to one of my friends. And I'm why am I even doing this? This is awful. So I feel like it started back then, but when I was a kid, entrepreneurship wasn't even in my vocabulary. I mean, my dad was a truck driver part-time. My mom never really could hold down a job. And it's not like I had any mentors or anything back then who were entrepreneurs. My mentors were who was on TV. I would watch Law and Order or, ER, which is kind of weird for a kid to watch ER, but to watch ER. And then, I loved football. So when you're a kid and you're poor, success to you is professional athlete, doctor, lawyer. That's what it is. Right. Sure. And so I wanted to be one of those three. Hated blood. Wasn't going to do that. Couldn't gain more than 180 pounds. So couldn't be a professional football player. So I kind of clawed my way into college thinking I wanted to go to law school. And so, I got into college barely on a football scholarship, and I did really well in school once I quit football. Cause like most founders, I feel like we think we can balance a million things, but in reality, that's not usually the case. So it was a one-track mind. I'm going to focus on school, got through college, graduated. And I had a mentor who, around that time, who was kind of telling me hey, you're not allowed to work full time and go to law school at the same time. You can do that at college. And that's what I was doing. I was going to school from 5 in the afternoon to 9 o'clock at night, Monday through Friday. And then I was working construction full time to pay for school from Monday through Friday, 6 in the morning to 3 o'clock, which is a pretty normal construction worker schedule. And when I found that out, I was well, I'm going to do this. Just like what an entrepreneur thinks, right? I'm going to do this no matter what. I just need to figure out a way to do it. And so I was well, I'll join the Army. The Army will pay for law school for me. Joined the Army, was an intelligence analyst. And that's when I started getting involved in tech. Like, again, tech wasn't a thing, really for me before then. But as an intelligence analyst in the military, that's really all we do. People kind of make jokes about it that we're just really good at PowerPoint, which is half true. And I did that for 3 years. And as I was transitioning out, I had a different mentor who told me, you can make just as much money going and working in tech as you could being a lawyer. And again, I didn't even know what that meant back then. I didn't know, like, what do you mean getting a job in tech? I had no context of what that was, but he showed me some stuff and I was like, that's what I'm going to do. Like, I'm going to go get a job in tech. Got a job as a business analyst at a development agency, worked there for 2 or 3 years. And that's when I really started getting my entrepreneur chops. Like, because when you work in a small town, and Charleston's not a small town, we're in Charleston, South Carolina, but it's not a big town. So like in any town where you work in tech, that's not huge, you don't have a choice but to also get involved in the entrepreneur community because the two are so closely tied together. And as non-technical founders, when you hear that somebody works at a tech company, you just assume they're a developer. So I had a lot of friends of mine in the entrepreneur community like, hey, you can help me build this thing, right? I'm like, well, I mean, not necessarily. Like I'm not a developer, but I can kind of like guide you through it. And I loved it. And I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to help entrepreneurs start things. And that's when like the current path that I'm on really started, was when I decided to like stop doing what I was doing. I'm going to start doing my own stuff and build my own company from there.
Wow.
That was a long-winded way of telling you everything. So
there's a lot to unpack there.
Perfect. So, let's do it.
Yeah. Let's take it back to when you were a kid. I'm sure having those types of experiences instilled, naturally a sense of resourcefulness that I'm sure is probably one of your biggest attributes to today.
Yeah, for sure. And I think resourcefulness isn't really talked about a lot with early stage founders, but it's one of those skills. I think everybody has an understanding that, first time founders probably aren't as likely to succeed as second time founders, as third time founders. And that's why when you look at successful startup founders, usually you find in their wake, like at least a few, even if it's just a small failed thing, usually at least a handful of small failed stuff. And I feel like the reason for that is because as you go, you learn to be more resourceful, right? Like a very black and white stark example of this is even just learning how to use something like Zapier. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Zapier or just any, it's like, okay, well, when you're starting your first startup, you're kind of like doing all this stuff. And then you realize there's these tools out here that can help you like automate like 90% of your job. It's like, wow, it would have been really nice if I knew how to do that when my first startup failed. And it was because like we had all these labor costs. I could have cut all the labor costs by just automating some of this stuff, right? It's like just little things like that. But yeah, I tie it kind of back to when I was a kid and just trying to figure out like, how am I just going to make money to survive? I think the other thing that helps too is, in addition to the resourcefulness, is just knowing what worst case scenario really looks like. Like when founders start something, I think they have this idea in their head, and I don't want to be a hypocrite. Sometimes I feel this way too. When things didn't go well, that worst case scenario was living on the street. Like you're just going to go bankrupt. You're never going to be able to get a job again. You're going to live on the street. Everybody's going to laugh at you and point at you when you're walking down the street. Like, look at that guy, his startup failed, right? It's like, that's not how it is. If your startup fails, you're just going to go back and get a job, probably pays the same amount as the job you left when you started your company. Everything will be fine. Like that's worst case scenario. And when you grow up in the environment that I grew up in, and you see that like, well, I know I'm never going back to that. So like, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of put things into perspective and say, even when things aren't good right now, it's like, they're never going to be as bad as it was back then,
Yeah, I think perspective is so key, especially relating to previous startups or businesses, knowing that like, okay, these challenges that I may be facing now are nothing compared to maybe those times that I was struggling when I didn't know that all of these resources were out there.
Right.
Do you think have you ever revisited your burgeoning art career?
No. And I look back on it now, and my mom, of course, like all moms, my mom ended up, thank God, getting clean. And she still has some of my drawings. And I'm like, I was able to sell those things to my friends. Like, wow, they either must have really liked me, or their expectations on what a good drawing was incredibly low, for a 12 or 13-year-old, So, but hey, maybe I was just a really good salesperson, and I was just really really good at getting them to buy something from me. I don't know.
As you keep scaling your business and you become more and more popular, those will just continue to increase in value. Hopefully they held on to them.
I know. She should save them. I'll sign them all. And then, she can sell them on eBay or something.
When you look back at your initial ventures, either as a kid or as a young adult, what would you classify as your greatest success? What actually clicked and started working and you continued with it?
I would say Launchpeer, definitely, Okay. I started a couple of things on the side. I remember the first thing I started was actually when I was in the military. In the military, there's these green books, we call them green books, that you have to carry around as a sergeant or an officer or whatever. And it's really just a way for you to like keep notes on what your soldiers are doing, tracking physical fitness scores and just inventory, stuff like that. And they're just like literally just green notebooks. I don't know why they're a special color for the military, but they are. And I always thought like, that's stupid. Why do we carry around these green books? Like we're all carrying around our cell phones. Like, and sure, there's some places that you can't bring your cell phone into, but like that's a rarity now in the military. So why isn't there some app or something that does this? So I remember that's the first thing. I think I signed up for some app builder, like one of those ones like a Squarespace for building apps. And, this was 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now. And so I'm sure it wasn't even great. I think it was like Appy Pie or something like that when they first started, and built like a green book version. And that was like the first thing that I did. I think it ended up getting to like 300, 400 downloads on the Android store. I don't think I released it on the App Store because the app builder didn't allow for that back then. And I didn't do anything. Like it was just, I think it just kind of snowballed and people were starting to get it. And I was like, oh, that's cool. But I didn't do anything with it. I didn't build it because I was trying to build a business. I was like, this is just dumb. I don't like doing this. I'm just going to build it myself and I'll use it. If other people use it, great. But that was the first thing that I tried. And I think in terms of like success, Launchpeer is definitely the thing that's been the most successful. And I think the thing that made Launchpeer more successful than other startups, and it wasn't always that way. The first 2 years at Launchpeer were terrible. And I can talk about that in a minute, but the big turning point after the first couple of years of Launchpeer, when it wasn't going well, was realizing that nobody cares about your product. Nobody cares about the service you provide, or nobody cares about the features that your app has, any of that stuff. Nobody cares about any of that stuff, because really all they care about is the problem that you're solving and how good a job you can be at communicating that message to your ideal people. So many founders today, especially tech startup founders, have this general feeling, even though they won't say it, but they have this general mentality of, if I build it, people will use it. And that is the farthest thing from the truth. Like, so true. If there's anything that you should do as a startup founder before you build anything, is get good at knowing how to get in front of your ideal customer, how to get them to want to sign up for your product, and then go ahead and build the product. And so like the first step of Launchpeer, and we could talk about this later if we want, but is basically we have our founders figure out traffic first, conversion second, and then build the product after that. As opposed to like for tech startups, typically you're supposed to build the MVP and then go get feedback from the market and stuff. It's like, that kind of voids the whole point of like figuring out how to get in front of the right people first. So knowing that sales and marketing was the most important thing. And I don't want to say the product is secondary, because I understand it's important, but no one cares about it if you can't get anyone to use it. I've seen so many founders spend $100K on an app that just sits on the sideline and collects dust, because like the founder was like, I thought people would use this. And it's like, no, like nobody's, you built this for no one, or you didn't really do the stuff that you needed to do beforehand to do it. So that was the big point for me.
I couldn't agree more with that theory. And that is like the foundation of my day job, which is Main Event Digital, where I saw the same thing, that these huge distributors would spend millions of dollars building these really full featured, e-commerce sites. And then they sat back and wondered why no one used them. Right. They never talked to the customer. They didn't understand their needs. They didn't even know if the customer wanted that. And they just thought, this is what people are doing. I'm going to do it too. I'm going to build it. And it just sits on the shelf. And that's where like my day job, that's where we come in to help them actually tell people about what they're doing and try to solve their customers' problems.
Well, and the hardest part with that too is I feel like people don't really understand that until they have messed up the first time. Like the founders who join Launchpeer and we teach them about our process, first time founders have a hard time understanding it. You know, they're like, well, if I just build this thing, like people will use it. They might not say that out loud, but that's what they're feeling. Yeah. Second time founders are like, oh my gosh, I should have done that before my first startup failed. It's like, okay, yes, right. Exactly. You know,
I feel like it's used more in relation to raising capital, but you ask for advice, you get money, you ask for money, you get advice really applies, because when you're talking with people immediately, not only are you facilitating that early user research, which will inform product direction, you're also building up interest from a customer base who will probably be those early adopters that you can sell to. So I think makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. So let's dive into Launchpeer a little bit more, because I'm intrigued by the business. Let's start with your greatest success stories, and what small ventures have you launched through the business that are just killing it today?
Yeah. So let's take a step back and say, like, so Launchpeer's been around it's been about 7 years now, a little bit over 7 years. And the first 2 years were kind of a wash. I mean, it was really like me in a room over the garage, just trying to figure it out, you know? And like, that's the time where I didn't put as much stock into sales and marketing as I probably should have. I focused so much on the product and didn't really think at all about, you know, what we were actually trying to do, you know, like trying to get in front of the right people. And the only reason I even got to the point where I figured something out was because I got desperate. Like the first 2 years, you know, I was basically like, my oldest son was 6 and my youngest son was 4. And so I was staying at home. My wife had to go back to work because the business wasn't pulling in as much income as it needed to. And this was happening so long. And I was like, this is not fair to my family. I need to either figure this out or I need to go back and get a job. So simultaneously, at the end of that first 2-year period, I made a decision, like, I'm going to do something crazy and, you know, try to, like, you know, fix this with one Hail Mary. And if it doesn't work at the same time, I'm going to be applying jobs. And I do remember that, like, I made a change, and the crazy change was, you know, and this is thinking back on it now, it like makes so much sense. But back then it felt crazy to do it, because when you start an agency, you get a client, you're just looking for money. I mean, that's really what you're doing, right? Like, you're just trying to survive. And so we initially started focusing on startups, but then, like, we'd have a healthcare company who's like, hey, can you help me build an app too? And we're like, yeah, I mean, why not? And then we would change our website to say, like, well, we help startups and healthcare companies. And then a small business would come and say, like, hey, can you help us build our website? And we're like, okay, yeah, we help healthcare companies, small business, and startups now, you know? And like, we got to the point where we were just not talking to anyone, you know? And I was like, why isn't this working? It's like, well, maybe because you're talking to 1,000 different people, you know? And the Hail Mary was, cut everything else. We're going to work only with startups. We're going to do fixed pricing because startups don't want to wonder how much their product's going to cost. We're going to focus on these little tiny services that we can do really, really quickly. And heck, if this doesn't work, I'm applying for jobs anyway. Like, it is what it is, right? And I remember within 2 to 3 months from there, I think it was actually 3 months from there, we went from me and a couple of contractors to my wife re-quitting her job, hiring 12 people, getting an office. And it was like, it worked, right? I was like, wow, okay, that's great. Like, you know, and, you know, so, you know, but even then, for the next 3 years, we were still just a development agency. Like, founders would come to us with an idea for an app. And we'd be like, yeah, man, we can build that 50K, 100K, 150K, whatever. The problem that we were seeing, though, about 2.5 years ago that we got upset about was founders, we would build these apps, founders would go off, they'd come back 6 months later and say, hey, Jake, I'm having trouble getting users, or I'm having trouble extending our runway because I can't raise funding or whatever. And the problem's almost always tied back to one of two things. It was either that they never validated the idea in the first place. And our job as an agency was not to make sure they validated their idea. It was just like, all right, you want to build something, I'll build it, like, whatever. But it usually tied back to that, or it tied back to them not being able to clearly communicate their value proposition specifically to one type of person. They were just trying to talk to anyone like we were doing before. And that wasn't something the investors wanted, because if you're not talking to you're talking to everyone, they know it's going to be expensive to fund and to get any sort of traction. And it also is going to be hard to get any level of traction in the first place, which means investors aren't even going to talk to you. So about 2.5 years ago, we changed up our model to be what it is today. Like, we need to educate our founders before we build them. So we went from building 50, $150,000, $200,000 apps to cutting all that. Now we're an accelerator, and we're going to have services mixed in, but also a lot of education to make sure founders don't make the mistakes that we were seeing founders make when we were first working with them. So now our success stories are really aligned with like, okay, what's success within the first year or two of a startup, right? Like the founders who joined our program. And for us, we've had some successes of founders getting accepted into Y Combinator, which if you don't work in tech startups, you might not know, but Y Combinator is like the gold standard of like, you're going to do really well if you can get into Y Combinator. Like, you might not even, just having that on your resume looks great. We've had founders have 10-figure exits, like $10-15 million exits. We've had founders who just build a business, and that, that's one of the things where it's like a lot of startup founders, and I make sure that we ask this question when founders are thinking about coming in, like, what do they want? And most of the time they'll say surface level things like, I want to build a successful startup. I want to build, I think we can be really big. But like, if you really get deep down and ask them what they really want, it's usually like freedom, control. I want to fulfill my potential. And it's like, you don't need to build a unicorn business to do that. Like, you can just build a good company that makes $1 million a year, $5 million a year, $10 million a year. Like, and so we really promote to our startup founders that like, some of you might be unicorns one day, and that's great, but I don't care. Like, I care that you're able to build a company that can sustain you and sustain your family. It gives you the freedom and control you're looking for, helps you take care of your employees, helps you feel like you can sustain that level of growth. And if you end up wanting to grow a unicorn, like, fantastic. But like, you don't have to do that today to feel successful. And typically, if you're a first-time founder, that's the most dangerous route to go, because it requires you taking on the most amount of risk, most amount of debt, most amount of capital from investors, most amount of, like, trying to go big in the market. Like, you don't have to do that to be successful. You can do something else.
So how do you find these ideal founders, or the founder profile that you just outlined, to work with, or how do they find you?
You're going to make me start nerding out on stuff, because this is like, I ended up being the founder who didn't really like marketing. And like, I didn't know anything about marketing and sales the first 2 years. And now, like, that's all I love to do. Like, I love marketing and sales. Like, I think it's awesome that you can like get your message in front of people, the very specific right type of person at the right time with the right message. Like, I feel like that's really exciting to me. So the way that we find founders is honestly like almost 100% through paid ads. So and the only reason that we're able to get that to work is because we have gotten so specific on the type of person that we're trying to help, right? Like, so many startups and just businesses in general, they really, if you ask them to describe their ideal avatar, like who they're trying to work with, they wouldn't really be able to do it. They try to describe 2 or 3 different types of people or a big portion of the market. It's like, no, tell me about Susan. Tell me about Joe. Like, tell me about Mike. And it's like, I can describe our founder, and some of your listeners might resonate with this. It's like, our ideal founder is Mike. Mike's married, has 2 kids, has a job that he works 40 hours a week, probably makes somewhere between 60 and 80K a year, is okay with his job, but feels like, he doesn't really love it. Probably has a stack of business books sitting under his nightstand that he bought off Amazon and hasn't really read all of them, maybe read 1 or 2, but it like just kind of gets lost in all the other work that he has to do. Really needs to scratch the entrepreneurial itch, but like doesn't really know where to start, knows it's a risk and doesn't want to risk his family's lifestyle or their future. It's kind of locked in this idea of like, it's good enough right now, but I know it could be better. I'm just kind of teetering on the fence of like trying to figure out what to do, right? I can describe that person in great detail, which means my ads can describe that person in great detail. I could talk about the problem and the solution in that level of detail. Most new startups, the biggest mistake that they make is that they don't get to that level of detail with their founders. So anyway, all of our founders come in through paid ads. We have a video that's on our website, and anybody can watch it if they want. It's like 15 minutes long. It just describes our process, what we do, how it works. everything, and then they decide whether or not they want to apply. And so at that point, if they apply, they talk to a member of our team. We have an admissions committee because we guarantee results for our founders. So we have to be pretty particular about who we decide to work with. If they're accepted, then they join our program. We kind of batch everybody up into monthly cohorts. If they don't get accepted, then they can reapply in 30 days. Usually if somebody doesn't get accepted, it has very little to do with the idea, because those change. It has a lot more to do with, is the person coachable? Like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. It's like, we're not going to accept that person into our program. Like if they're not willing to do what we tell them to do. And from the time that we've been doing this, the founders who don't get the results are the ones who don't do what we tell them to do, and that's just like across the board. I'm sure working in marketing, you guys probably have noticed this, that like, yeah, if you just do what I tell you to do, like you'll get some level of result. If you don't be mad at me if you don't listen to what I tell you to do, and it's just like a common theme. So we're really looking for founders who are very coachable, understand that they know probably a lot about their industry, but don't know a lot about building a tech startup. But that's kind of what we're here for,
And are there any industries that you tend to gravitate towards or shy away from?
So right now we only work with software. So, and that's because like we have that hybrid approach, right? Where we have like designers and UI UX designers on our team who do that for our founders. And we have developers who do that for our founders as well. In the future, we do plan on expanding out like to hardware startups or e-commerce startups, but we haven't kind of progressed to that point yet. Like right now, we're really locked into the tech startup space. But in terms of industry, we're really agnostic. We've had cannabis startups go through our program. We've had real estate, construction, legal, medical, all across the board. Like to us, it doesn't really matter as long as it's an idea that we feel is something that, and look, most ideas that we talk with our founders about are like not fully fleshed out, but as long as the idea has the potential to be a venture scalable business at some point, even if they don't go that route, then, and they're coachable, that's kind of what we're looking for.
Are your customers, when you're investing in them, are you self-funded or do you have VC backing you? And what do you typically invest in your customers?
Yeah. So we charge our founders to go through our process. So it's not free. And so we don't fund our founders necessarily. What we do is we fund them through the services we provide. So the way our program works is it's broken up into 2 phases. So phase 1 of Launchpeer is, we call it proof, prototype, and pre-seed. So proof is flesh out the idea, prove the market metrics with it, make sure that they can get traffic and conversions, basically like validation of the offer. The second step is prototyping. So that's where they work with our design team and our development team to scope out their app, design it, put it into a nice interactive prototype so they can showcase it to potential investors of like, hey, this is what I'm going to be building. And then pre-seed is where we help them raise pre-seed capital. So anywhere from, 15 to 50K. A lot of our founders have raised up to like 100 and 250K at that stage. And that's pre-product. Like they haven't built anything yet. And so the culmination of that is them potentially entering into phase 2. So phase 2 is product, where we build their MVP. So that's where our developers get more involved. The next phase is launch. We help them get their first users and customers. And then the last phase is seed, where now they're progressing to more institutional investors, like $50,000 checks, $100,000 checks, like the bigger checks, with people that wouldn't even talk to them if they didn't have a product attraction, And so ideally our founders get through our program at the end and are able to get to the point where they raised at least 100K in capital. That's the goal. Although the more we can help them raise, the better, obviously.
And you're taking a percentage of ownership of these small businesses?
No, we're totally equity free. So our program is 15K, and that covers all of the things that I just described. The way that we have our guarantee structured is if a founder isn't able to raise at the pre-seed steps, that midway point, if they're not able to raise at least 15K, which kind of covers the cost of what the program was, then we'll just refund them. And so, we'll try to help them over and over and over again. If they are not able to raise that, then we'll just refund them. And in the last 2.5 years that we've been offering that, we've only ever done that to 2 people. Like 2 people have gotten that refund, and we're happy to give it, but we just know it's a rarity that somebody will get it because we know our process works. And so we're able to do something like that, which is kind of rare in the startup space, considering, a lot of startups, I think only 4 to 5% of startups ever raise any level of capital. So, we've kind of like really honed in on that being a big part of our process.
What, as far as the percentage of people you approve or accept that apply, what does that look like?
So right now it's about 8%. That kind of fluctuates month over month. I mean, some months we get more applications than others. Like during the pandemic, it was oddly enough, we got way more applications than we did otherwise. And I think a lot of it, when I talked to founders, it seemed like a lot of it was like, well, I'm working from home now, so my boss can't tell if I'm working on my startup or I'm working on something else. Like, oh, I mean, I'll take it, whatever, it's like, I don't care. But yeah, we got a lot more applications then, but yeah, it's always hovered between somewhere like 7 on the low end to maybe 10% on the high end.
And how many customers do you have? And how many,
so we
how big's your
onboard,
team?
Yeah, we onboard about 8 to 12 founders a month, depending on like the month. Like sometimes it's a lot less, sometimes it's a lot more, because we're doing some services for our founders. That's the only reason why we have to like be very careful about the bandwidth, because if it was just totally education, like most incubators and accelerators, like even Y Combinator, for example, it's just all office hours and mentorship. They could take on as many startups as they want. For us, like we're doing the design for our founders, we're doing the development for our founders. We have to like keep it at a certain level, but typically about 8 to 12 a month. Right now we have 18 full-time team members, and including contractors, about 26. I think we're at 28 now, if you add the contractors. And we're totally remote. Our whole program is designed to be remote, part-time, self-paced. This isn't like a 16-week program and you're out. This is like, hey, you're at Launchpeer as long as it takes for you to get the result. Because I mean, like for our types of founders, life just kind of happens. It's like I have kids, I have a wife, I got to go on vacation, I got to change jobs. It's like, I never liked the traditional accelerator model of like, hey, it's 12 weeks, whatever you can get done here in 12 weeks is fine. And then we're going to keep 7% of your company. And it's like, good luck. I mean, hopefully everything works out. It's like, I don't like that. Mm-hmm. I think it's fine in certain situations, but I feel like for most founders, the kinds that we work with, that's not really a good deal, I guess.
Jake, can you speak to the pre-seed funding environment a little bit? Because I know there are a lot of founders who have this idea, and then when they start thinking about raising capital, they realize that more of your traditional venture funds are all Series A. You need a lot of traction to even get your foot in the door with them. And then they hear, okay, the other option is more of a friends and family round. But I know I've spoken, myself included, and have spoken with other founders who kind of go, well, at this early of our business, when we're not really sure where this is going to go, we might not feel comfortable even asking friends or family for 10, 15, 20, $50,000 checks. Can you maybe just speak a little bit at a high level to just what that environment looks like currently, or maybe a few tips for founders who need some capital to get moving, to start proving out the idea so that they can then go back out and raise that larger amount through more traditional channels?
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing I'll say is let's talk about the market as a whole, like macro level, right? Like since the economy is kind of weird right now, right? Like that's obviously had a huge impact on the venture capital market. And so a lot of founders are worried about it. But for new founders, what I tell them is like, you of anyone in the venture market right now have the least amount to worry about. And like, let me explain why. Like the reason that the market's weird right now in VC is not for the same reason that it's weird in like just economic inflation, et cetera. The reason it's weird is because the current economic environment spooked investors who were overvaluating seed and Series A startups over the last, really honestly, it's been like the last 5 to 10 years. Startups who had no revenue were getting valued at like 30, 40, $50 million when like in any realm of reality would be ridiculous, right? And so the problem and the reason that less startups are raising capital now, and I think that it's for seed, I think it's gone down about 18%. For Series A, I think it's gone down about 30%. The reason for that is those same investors who were giving them those valuations over the last 5 to 10 years are now looking at it with more realistic glasses on and saying, well, even though you've made a little bit of progress the last 2 years, we still can't justify the valuation that you had that we gave you 2 or 3 years ago. And so those founders are having to go raise down rounds, which means you raised it at a $30 million valuation 2 years ago, and now you can't be valued at that much. So you're raising it at a $20 million valuation. Investors don't like funding startups who have to do that. So this is why you're seeing a lot of layoffs in the tech sector, because what's the best way to bolster your valuation? It's either cut costs or increase revenue to increase profitability, or to extend runway so they can get past this like time, even though like this is honestly the new normal, and it should have been the normal the whole time, because it's just more common sense. Like nobody should get valued at 30 million when you haven't built anything yet, right? It doesn't make any sense. But for pre-seed stage startups, they didn't do that, right? Like they never got valued 2 or 3 years ago. They didn't get overvalued at some. So like they're coming into the market and it's a little bit different. So even though, yes, it's not as easy today as it was a couple of years ago to raise a pre-seed round, it's still possible. Now, from a tactical perspective, you're 100% right. Like I find that friends and family is a good thing to raise, but I'm not one of those people who's like, look, I was homeless when I was a kid. Like my family doesn't have any money. Like my mom still doesn't have a ton of capital. My dad passed away when I was in high school. So like I can ask all my family, like, yeah, give me some money. My mom might throw $100 my way because I'm her son and I'm her favorite. So it's like, she might give me something, but it's not going to be enough for me to fund a startup. But what I tell founders is like, it doesn't matter if you get $1 from friends and family or you get $100,000 from friends and family. The point of raising friends and family is less about how much you get and more about going to a more traditional investor and saying, I was able to get backing from the people that are closest to me, right? And they don't necessarily care how much that is, but if you don't raise friends and family, they're going to be looking at you and saying like, well, how much you've raised yet? Nothing. Well, your friends and people don't even believe in you enough to give you even a little bit of cash. Like that seems weird, right? Like it's kind of strange, even if it's like absolutely nothing, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But the first group that we have our founders go to after friends and family is not traditional investors. We actually call them like either non-traditional investors or untapped investors. Most people call them non-traditional investors, but this group, to go to your saying of like, well, if you ask for money, you're going to get advice. If you ask for advice, you're going to get money. We call them untapped because what's the difference between an angel investor and somebody who has a lot of money? Well, one calls themselves an angel investor and one doesn't call themselves an angel investor, right? Like I would consider Ryan Reynolds, if you asked him what he did every day, he'd say, I'm an actor or performer or whatever, or I'm married to Blake Lively, which is like a whole big accolade in itself, right? It's like, so, but he does invest in companies. He invests in companies all the time. It's just, he doesn't call himself, like he doesn't go to parties and like brag about being a VC or an angel investor or anything like that. We have our founders go ask for advice from people who are do a good job in the industry that the startup founder is working in. And a lot of times those conversations naturally transition into one of a couple of things. Either it's just a good conversation and they learn a lot from somebody who's way smarter than they are. Great. Second thing that could happen is the person's like, hey, this sounds great. What are you guys doing right now? Oh, you're raising capital. Like I know some people who might be interested. Okay, great. Next thing that could happen is like, oh, you guys are raising capital. Send me your deck. Like, let me take a look at it. Right. It's like worst case scenario, you get some good advice. Best case scenario, that asking for advice ends up turning into money. The other thing that a lot of times happens is these people are like, yeah, throw me on your deck. I wouldn't mind, like, if you want to give me a call or shoot me an email sometime, I'll be an advisor. Having those people on your deck when you go to traditional investors is like, makes you look great. If you're a healthcare startup and you can get a Harvard educated doctor who works in your town to decide like, yeah, sure, throw me on your deck, like whatever. Like I'll send you an email back and forth every once in a while. The investor's going to look at that and say like, wow, this looks great. And one thing that I can't stress enough about raising funding is raising capital is just sales and marketing. Like we all fluff it up and make it seem like it's bigger than it is, but it's like, it's prospecting for investors. It's selling the idea and the vision, not necessarily the product and the features, but the vision. That's why the founder of WeWork is able to raise $350 million like 3 days ago. And it's like, well, why is he able to do that? Why was she able to raise that much money? Why was all these other founders who like have nothing behind the scenes able to raise so much capital and not only do it once, but do it again after they messed it up the first time? It has nothing to do with anything other than they are so good at marketing and sales that they can convince anyone to do anything. Now, I'm not saying you should lie to people, but just keep that in mind. Like some founders, I feel like they think it's about their product or they think it's about the idea. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with like, how good are you at selling the vision to someone who you want to fund you? Because you have to keep in mind too, like you're trying to get money from someone for nothing. At least for a user or customer, they're getting some benefit out of your product, $10 a month, $15 a month. I get to use this project management software or whatever. An investor's giving you $100K and might never, ever see that money back again. So like, is raising capital going to be hard? Yeah. because you're getting money for nothing. Like, obviously it's going to be difficult. I don't even want to give my son $10 for mowing the lawn. Like, I'm not going to give Sony $100K for what? Something I might not see for 10 years. Like, that becomes a little bit difficult. Sorry. Hopefully I answered your question. I don't know. I don't know
Oh, you did. No, I think that's a very wise approach. And like you said, you have the optionality of generating a lot of benefit from just having these types of conversations with those folks. So,
and unfortunately, the way the world works today, it's a lot more about who you know and less about how good you are at whatever you're doing. Right. It's like, I see people that are famous today and I'm like, they're not that smart. They're not that good at what they do, but like, they are really good at selling themselves. They're really good at marketing. Like, that's what separates them. So like, if you're not willing to get on that train, you maybe want to reconsider your whole path in the first place.
Network.
Yeah. And I'm an introvert. So like, I sympathize with founders who don't like doing that stuff.
It can be a lift. So Jake, how do you, with all of this going on, how do you stay sane? When you were highlighting earlier your law school experience, where it was essentially 6 a.m. until 9 p.m. every day, and that doesn't take into account any homework or preparation for tests and other life commitments, that sounds quite overwhelming. What do you do to maintain some sense of normalcy, whether it was then when you're in the military, nowadays? What tactics do you use?
I think the thing that helps me is trying to stay tied to what my long-term goals are, and look, to be honest, I am not that kid I was when I was in college. Like, I'm 34 now. I think I'm 34. I've probably been 34 for like 3 years now, but I'm pretty sure I'm 34. And I don't have that level of energy anymore. I wish I did, but I don't know how I did that when I did it. But I'd say today it's like keeping myself tied to like what my long-term goals are, and knowing that, trying to remember that like this kind of success doesn't happen overnight. Like, one of the problems I feel like with business culture, just in general, is by the time we find out about a new startup, they're usually 7 or 10 years in, maybe less, maybe 3 or 4 years in. But because we have this recency bias, we see them for the first time and we feel like they're brand new. Like, look at how nice their product looks. Look how great their business looks like it's doing. And it's like, yeah, but they've been around for 5 or 10 years now. Like, you're just finding out about them now only because they're on the cover of this magazine, but like, they went through a lot to get to where they are today. Like, there's very small exceptions to that rule, right? But vast majority of businesses, I don't care if it's a tech startup or anything, it's like, by the time you find out about them and they're successful, the founder or the founding team probably went through a lot of tough stuff before they got to that. And I think for me, the thing that kind of keeps me locked in is just knowing like, what is my long-term goal for? And for me personally, it's just my family. Like, I want to build something that allows me to have freedom. Like, if my son has a baseball game on Friday, I want to be able to go to it. Like, if my, in terms of retirement, like, I'd love to be able to like retire early, and those things don't come for free. Like, sacrifices have to be made today in order to make that possible in the future. That's one. The other thing that helps too is more like woo-woo stuff. Like, I meditate every day. I never used to do that. And I'm still not great at it. Like, I use Day One, which is I think it's called Day One. It's like a journaling app. And I just literally turn on record and just talk to myself. Is this weird? Should I be talking about this? This is TMI. But I talk to myself on there and just like get my thoughts out of my head, and I think for startup founders, I use this analogy of sometimes we have to wear the Captain Kirk hat and sometimes we have to wear the Spock hat. Like, Captain Kirk is what most of us default to, which is like rash, make decisions from our gut, like a lot of things floating in our head at one time. Spock is more like data-driven and analytical. And for us startup founders, because we live in that Kirk mode most of the time, we need to like dump everything out every once in a while. All of our ideas, all the things that are in our head, all that stuff. And a lot of times it's very difficult to do that with a spouse or a family member, because like they don't understand any of this stuff, right? Like, if I dumped everything onto my wife, she'd be like, she'd probably feel way overwhelmed because like there's nothing she can do about it. And she's just going to hear all the bad stuff. Right. So like, but my iPad won't do that. Like my iPad doesn't have any feelings or emotions. It's just going to listen to me and be like, okay, you got everything out of your head and now it's gone. And so for new startup founders, when you feel overwhelmed, try to write or get everything out of your head. Just try to like not live in your own head so much. I feel like when I've done that in the past, that's when like I start drinking too much or don't get enough sleep, or, I ignore my family, or I feel like I have to go to work every day, all day. And it's like the amount of time you put into your business does not equal the amount of results you're going to get. That's another lesson I had to learn, because I always thought like, well, if I just work 80 hours a week, like something good will happen. Right. It's like, that's like thinking you're going to go to the gym and just bench press and do only bench press and be there every day, all day, and you're going to lose weight. It's like, no, I mean, you might have a huge chest, but like those two things like don't necessarily align. Like just because you live at the gym doesn't mean you're going to hit your goals. Right. And it's the same thing for a startup founder. Like you just have to think like, what are you trying to do, and take small measurable steps to get there. And it's going to take a long time, and just keep that perspective,
Jake, out of respect for your time, let's go into maybe some final nuggets of wisdom you have for our listeners. And I think we'll wrap it after that.
I'd say like, if you're thinking about starting a business, the big piece of advice I'll give you is you don't have to go all in all at once. Like you don't have to quit your job right now. You don't have to build a $500,000 app right now. You don't have to hire 20 people right now. Like you don't have to do it in a year. Like it took me years, and it takes most founders that I know years before they hire a lot of people, have a ton of capital. Like it's going to take some time. So like this is, there's a book by Simon Sinek called The Infinite Game. It's a great book. It basically just talks about how a lot of business owners think that there's a definitive like win, like you're playing a game and there's like an endpoint, like you're going to win, like Monopoly, right? It's like, that's not how business ownership works. Like this is kind of an infinite game. And if you play as if there's a winner, then you will constantly be chasing your tail, constantly be chasing competitors. And it's like, you can't treat it that way. You have to treat it like there is no end. And that's a good thing. Like as entrepreneurs, even if this one business ends, I know a lot of founders, like they would never go back and work for somebody else. Like that's just not in our DNA. Like you might do it for a little bit, but it's not going to happen very often. For founders who are already running their business, especially right now, because right now times are really tough, I would tell them, try to keep that perspective. Like try to remember every day why you're doing this, and like letting people go is hard. Like firing people is hard. And I know a lot of founders are having to do that right now. Like trying to figure out where your money is going to go and where you're going to cut and where you're going to spend. Like that's hard. And you're going to have those hard times, but remember that you have an ultimate goal at the end of the day. And these are just tiny, small roadblocks on the way to hitting whatever goal it is that you're trying to hit. So like, if you have to write it up on the wall, you have to put on a sticky note, put on a computer, do whatever you have to do, but just like stay locked into where it is that you're trying to go. And like, you'll get there at some point, whether tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now, doesn't matter.
Awesome. Thanks for all of your advice. And it's been very insightful today. And we've really appreciated learning about your story, and congratulations on your success, and best of luck to you going forward.
Cool.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here and your time.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. Like really good questions. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jake.
All right.
Everybody got a dream, let me show you all love. From an idea, working it into a startup. This the show that you need, what more could you ask for? Never know who become the CEO next door. Tune in, every episode insightful. The type of vibe you will want to subscribe to. Let's go. Hey.